Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, my name is Scott Harris King, and today I've got a little story that I think you'll find interesting about a fascinating back issue from DC Comics history that's been widely overlooked, but I think is one of the most important comics that they ever published, and unfortunately begins a storyline that would have been one of the greatest storylines in DC history if they hadn't have canceled it. So what am I talking about? Well, to set the stage, let's talk about Wonder Woman, the new look Wonder Woman. For long-time Wonder Woman and comic fans, the story of what happened with the new look Wonder Woman is pretty well known. I've got here in my hand Wonder Woman number 178. So in the late 60s, Wonder Woman sales weren't doing very well, and they decided to do a drastic overhaul of the book where Wonder Woman lost her powers and she gained a new mentor in this kung fu expert named I Ching, and he taught her how to become this super spy in the classic 60 sense. And she went around for several years with no powers fighting crime. But as the story goes, what most people are aware of is that in 1972, Gloria Steinem, who is a famous feminist leader and at the time was sort of the face of the feminism movement, complained to DC Comics about their depowering of Wonder Woman because she viewed Wonder Woman as an important feminist icon. And so DC said, you know what, she's right, we're going to give Wonder Woman her powers back. And so in issue 204 of Wonder Woman, they did just that. Here's issue 204. It's the first appearance of Nubia, but it's also the first issue where Wonder Woman gets her powers back and she's got her costume back and all's right with the world. At least that's the story everybody knows. But there's actually, it turns out, a much more complicated, deeply ironic, somewhat frustrating, and just mind-blowing backstory behind the decision to give Wonder Woman her costume and powers back. That's why in this episode I'm going to be highlighting what I think is the real key issue here, one of the best and most important issues of Wonder Woman ever published. It's Wonder Woman number 203, the last issue featuring the new look Wonder Woman. So if you look at Wonder Woman number 203, a couple things will jump out to you. Right up here at the top, it has this thing that says Special Women's Lib Issue, and then DC immediately, completely, and unironically undercuts that entire message by having this incredibly exploitative bondage cover where this woman's tied up and her boobs are sticking out like intercontinental ballistic missiles about to blow Russia clean off the map if she's not devoured by hungry dogs instead. So it's just a clear mixed message, and you might be wondering just looking at the cover, I know I did, what are they thinking here? Why did they put this cover on what's supposed to be a special women's lib issue? Well, this is where things get complicated, because for me this shows the regime change behind the scenes in Wonder Woman between when this story was devised and when it was actually published, because there's people that were trying to do something really exciting and interesting with Wonder Woman. There were people who didn't want that to happen, and then there's people who were brought in as unsuspecting dupes to destroy what would have been one of the great storylines of all time. So let's see what we actually have in the book. Wonder Woman 203 is of some interest and gains a little bit of notoriety for people to know because it's one of two issues that were written by one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, Samuel R. Delany, known to his friends as Chip. Now, in 1972, Samuel R. Delany was still a young man. He was in his early 20s. He had just won 2 Nebula Awards for Best Novel, and he was working on what was going to be one of his most famous, arguably most famous works, Dahlgren. Samuel R. Delany is an African-American author. He's also part of the LGBTQ community, and so for him, I think Wonder Woman was an icon, and he had a unique interest and understanding of the character. And he was brought onto the book by Denny O'Neil, who had been responsible for creating the new look Wonder Woman to begin with. And in Samuel R. Delany's first issue, which is the previous one, 202, it's sort of a really weird one-off story where they're introducing the fantasy characters Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, who were done by a famous author, Fritz Leiber, who were very popular at the time, into the DC universe before they got spun off into their own series. But once that was out of the way, we get this here, Samuel R. Delany doing what he really wants to do with a storyline of Wonder Woman that is, when you read it, one of the most complex and interesting Wonder Woman comics ever published. And when you read it in the context of 1972, it's mind-blowing because some of the stuff he's doing in here is much more nuanced and interesting than anything that's been done since or even in the present day. And the issues he brings up here are still relevant. So what happens in the course of this story is Diana Prince has got a roommate here, and there's an opening of a department store aimed at women here called Grandees. And over the course of this story, we find out a few different things that are going on with Grandees. First of all, they want to use Wonder Woman as advertising. And the guy who owns the store, here, let me just show you that panel again. He's unveiling his idea to Wonder Woman here, that she's going to be as like a famous sort of feminist icon in the DC universe. Women are going to come to the store because they see that she shops there. And Wonder Woman is reluctant to get involved, but basically they convince her that they're on the side of women and the women's movement, and they're actually not, but they're lying. They're orchestrating things to do this. Meanwhile, Wonder Woman's roommate has discovered that the department store is actually getting all of their stuff from cut rate labor in the city. So it's all low quality stuff where they basically have these sweatshops that are making the stuff, and they're actually paying all of their employees below minimum wage, and all of those employees are basically poor women of color. And this becomes important because what ends up happening in the storyline is that Wonder Woman is convinced that they're actually good people that have women's best intent in mind. And she has this great argument with her roommate here, where her roommate basically says, you claim to be for women, and yet you're not really helping women. And Wonder Woman's like basically sort of spouting this sort of American dream sort of thing, like, well, everybody can drag themselves up by their bootstraps, and we shouldn't be giving preferential treatment to anyone, even if they're even women. Everybody should be equal. And her roommate calls her out on this and basically says to her, that's easy for you to say because you're Wonder Woman. And she's calling her out specifically on privilege. Now, it's not exactly white privilege at this point in the story. We're actually going to see this later on. Again, this is 1972. But she calls her out on this, and she says to her, it's easy for you to dismiss the concerns of the everyday people like us, because as Wonder Woman, you don't have to deal with the same sort of sexism that we do, because you're in a privileged position. You had powers, but you're this famous superheroine, and so everybody treats you differently than they treat the rest of us. So Wonder Woman's kind of like, okay, I think you're wrong, but I'm going to listen to you. And she agrees to come to this women's lib meeting that they're going to have. And they have this meeting that is basically a mix of sort of white liberals, and there are some women of color, but they're sort of intellectuals. They're professors and stuff. During the meeting, the guy they're talking about organizing a union and doing a protest to shut down this store line. And so the guy that runs the store hires all of these thugs, to break up the meeting and attack and harass the women. And they kidnap the roommate, and that's where we have the bondage scene with the dogs, and Wonder Woman saves her. But we have this interesting metaphor where the men are pretending to be allies, but they're actually not. And then at the end, we have this fantastic sequence where the women basically in this women's lib group, they get the store shut down, and they're having their celebratory meeting, and here we have a group of women of color who break into the meeting and basically are like, you claim that you're doing all these things for women, but now I've got 250 poor women of color who have no other opportunities, who now don't have jobs. And yes, they were getting paid below minimum wage, less than they should have been getting paid, but now they're getting paid nothing. And this is about what they call intersectional feminism. And this is something, if you look this, like, it's still a major problem today. If you look at stuff that happened in the Women's March just a couple years ago, it was the same divide. And here we are in this comic, 1972, where Samuel R. Delany is bringing all of these issues in a very nuanced way into the comic universe and discussing them at incredible length. And the amazing part is, this is actually supposed to be just the beginning of this incredible, mind-blowing 6-part storyline. And when I tell you what his plot was for the other 5 issues that were never published, you're just going to be blown away by the idea that this would have taken place in 1972. So let me just read to you the description that he gave. This is a quote from Samuel R. Delany where he was talking about this, right? I've got my computer screen here. I'm going to hold this up so you have something to look at while I'm talking. This was an interview that he did for a preface of one of his books. He says, I came up with a 6-issue story arc, each with a different villain. The first was a corrupt department store owner. The second was the head of a supermarket chain who tries to squash a women's food cooperative. Again, we're talking about food cooperatives, 1972. Another villain was a college advisor who really felt a woman's place was in the home, and who assumed if you were a bright woman, then something was probably wrong with you psychologically, and so forth. And again, this is something we see in, it's a big issue at the time, where women would go to these universities and they'd be passed over for jobs, they'd be passed over for getting degrees, they wouldn't be let in. And he's addressing all of this here. So he continues, he says, it worked up to a gang of male thugs trying to squash an abortion clinic staffed by women's surgeons. And Wonder Woman is going to do battle with each of these and triumph. Now, just to remind you, this is 1972 he's talking about when he's doing this. Roe versus Wade didn't happen until 1973. So when he's talking about a storyline where Wonder Woman's going to fight off a group of thugs that are trying to attack an abortion clinic, abortion wasn't legal yet. When you think about it, it's unquestionably the boldest and most progressive feminist storyline that would have ever been published in comics, even up till today, in my opinion. Now, there's been a lot of stuff that I haven't read, but in terms of mainstream comics, just think about what this is talking about. And looking at issue 203 here, the nuance that he puts into the positions of the different women, he's discussing like real world stuff here. Now, this is all from a research, a paper that was done by a woman named Ann Matsuuchi, who is a faculty member at LaGuardia Community College in New York. She did a whole paper on this, and I'm going to have that linked below. So this is what Samuel R. Delany was planning to do. Now, obviously, we have issue 204, and we know what really happened. And what really happened is, in the comics, Samuel R. Delany's gone. Robert Kanigher, who had been writing Wonder Woman for decades before he was kicked off the book when they went into this new look Wonder Woman, has returned. He gives her powers back. He gets her costume back. And in the first issue, he kills I Ching. He's dead. He introduces Nubia, and he does this like 3-part storyline with some nods to feminism and race issues, and then he immediately dumps all of that out of the book and starts literally just rewriting and having them redraw some of his kid-centric stories from the late 40s and 1950s, where they're like fighting, riding kangaroos, which I love, but he just dumps all of this. And so when you look at what Samuel R. Delany was doing, and I guess it's no surprise to think that DC probably didn't want to publish this, right? Just imagine the third rail that they would have been grabbing. But you can also imagine that DC had a major problem here because they have one of the most famous and popular at the time writers in science fiction, someone who's very well known beyond comics, just in the general sort of writing community, and in Samuel R. Delany, who's coming in, and they can't, on a political level, you can just imagine the bad PR it would be if they just canceled this storyline that this famous author had written. They would have been in hot water with a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons, because you can't just cancel this feminist, pro women's lib storyline from this great author without having a bunch of backlash, right? So how did they get away with it? Here's where Gloria Steinem comes into play. So again, the story that we've heard is true. It's just not all the story. So in 1972, Gloria Steinem was the head of the face and the head of the women's movement at the time. And she was about to publish the first issue of Ms. Magazine. And she grew up as a big fan of Wonder Woman. She correctly recognized that Wonder Woman was designed originally by the creators to be a feminist character and a feminist icon with a feminist message. And so she identified with that, and she felt like Wonder Woman having her powers taken away was taking away the power of women. And she wanted to use Wonder Woman on the cover of Ms. Magazine, the first issue of Ms. Magazine. So she talked to DC and they formed a relationship. And what they decided to do was, in conjunction with Ms. Magazine coming out with Wonder Woman on the cover, they were also going to put out a collection of classic Wonder Woman stories that were curated by Gloria Steinem herself. So it would be stories that she herself liked, and those would come out at the same time. So Gloria Steinem visited the DC offices, and while she was there, going, just making these deals and discussing this stuff and going through the archives to pick out her stories for this Wonder Woman collection, she told DC that her unhappiness with the new look Wonder Woman and how she felt like it was cutting into the empowerment of women and the empowerment of characters in a very big symbolic way. And so DC had this light bulb go off. Here's where the ironic part comes in. Basically, Gloria Steinem then gave them the political cover to cancel Samuel R. Delany's incredibly progressive feminist storyline, because what they were able to do was they cut his storyline, and they said, well, Gloria Steinem has said that she doesn't like the new look Wonder Woman, and we totally agree with her. We want to have a powerful, progressive Wonder Woman, so we're going to give her her costumes and her powers back just the way they should be. Now, Gloria Steinem, of course, had no idea of what was going to be coming out with Samuel R. Delany's storyline because of the production schedule. Issue 203 hadn't been published yet at this time, right? So she didn't know this was coming out. She had no idea that this was in the works, but DC knew. And so it was sort of this incredibly ironic situation where DC got to claim that they were being feminist by bringing the new Wonder Woman back. Gloria Steinem got to crow to everyone, which she has publicly, about this great thing that she was able to pull off by convincing DC to bring back the powered Wonder Woman. The two of them had this love fest, and there was all this great publicity for DC. But it came at the cost of the most feminist and most progressive and most interesting and forward-thinking story about feminism and the women's lib movement that would have ever been done. Way, way more than anything that actually came out. And it's ironic, incredibly ironic to just think about what could have happened, and all we have left to look at, to see, to imagine what would have happened is this one single issue, 203. So that's it. I've gone on a little too long about this, but I hope you found this interesting. And thanks for watching. I've got a thing here you can subscribe, and I've got some videos here you can watch, and there's a like button and stuff. Let me know what you think in the comments. I don't want the comments to get too political here. But it's an inherently political issue, so it's understandable if it does, but I'd rather keep the focus on the comics than on the politics. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.